Marcus stared at the stranger, his medical training warring with something primal that recognized truth in those ancient eyes. The emergency room erupted around them, nurses shouting vitals, machines beeping frantically, the storm outside hammering the windows like an impatient god demanding entry. "Get him out of here!" Marcus barked to security, but his voice lacked conviction. Elena's blood pressure was dropping too fast, her pulse thready and weak. Internal bleeding, massive trauma. They had minutes, maybe less. "Dr. Thorne." Adrian's voice cut through the chaos with unnatural clarity. "Look at her chart. Really look." Marcus's eyes flicked to the paramedic's report. Type AB-negative blood. The rarest type, and their supplies had been critically low even before tonight's storm knocked out half the city's power grid. The backup generators were straining, and the blood bank's refrigeration units were failing. "We don't have her type," Nurse Patricia called out, her usually steady voice cracking. "The nearest hospital with AB-negative is across town, but with these roads—" A transformer exploded outside, plunging half the ER into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that reminded Marcus of the night his daughter died. Different hospital, same helplessness, same feeling of time slipping through his fingers like water. "Please," Elena whispered, her eyes finding his. Those eyes, dark brown flecked with gold, just like Sophie's. "I don't want to die. I have work to finish. A painting. It's been waiting for me for 3 years. Her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. 3 years. The same amount of time he'd been running from his failure, from the moment he'd had to tell a 5-year-old girl that Daddy couldn't fix her this time. Adrian stepped closer, his pale hand resting on the gurney's rail. Despite the chaos, despite the blood and antiseptic and fear that permeated the ER, Marcus caught something else in the air around this stranger. Something that smelled like rain and old libraries and time itself. "I've been watching you, Doctor," Adrian said quietly, his words somehow reaching Marcus clearly despite the noise. "Night after night, you come here seeking redemption, trying to save strangers because you couldn't save her. You don't know anything about Sophie Marie Thorne, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. She died on a night much like this one during your last week as a pediatric oncologist." Adrian's expression held no cruelty, only a terrible understanding. "You blamed yourself for the treatment failure, for the experimental therapy that gave her 3 extra months but ultimately couldn't give her a lifetime." Marcus's hands stilled on Elena's wrist, where her pulse fluttered like a dying bird. "How do you—" "Because I've walked this earth long enough to recognize a soul in torment." Adrian's eyes met his, and in their depths Marcus saw something impossible, memories that stretched back centuries, and a pain that made his own grief feel newly born. "I know what it means to watch someone die when you possess the power to save them. The question is, what are you willing to sacrifice for a second chance?" Elena's breathing grew more labored. On the monitors, her vital signs painted a grim picture that Marcus had read too many times before. In his peripheral vision, he saw Patricia preparing the crash cart, her movements efficient but resigned. They both knew how this would end. "The ritual I speak of is older than medicine, older than your science," Adrian continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But it comes with a cost that can never be undone. She would live, yes, but she would live as I do, sustained by blood, bound to darkness, watching centuries pass while everyone she's ever loved crumbles to dust. That's impossible. You're talking about vampirism." The word hung in the air like a challenge. "I know how it sounds to a man of science, but look at her, Doctor, really look. Do you see acceptance in those eyes? Do you see someone ready to let go?" Marcus looked down at Elena, this stranger who had somehow become his chance at redemption. Her fingers had found his sleeve, gripping it with surprising strength. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming the same word over and over, "please," just like Sophie had, in those final moments. The storm outside intensified, and another power surge sent the lights flickering. In that strobing darkness, Adrian seemed to become something more than human, taller, more substantial, his eyes reflecting the emergency lighting like a predator's. "Time is running out," Adrian said. "And this choice, this burden, it cannot be mine alone. I can offer the gift, but you must choose to accept it, for her. The question you need to ask yourself is simple. Is existence, even a dark one, better than oblivion?" Marcus felt the weight of 3 years' worth of sleepless nights pressing down on him. In the distance, thunder rolled across Seattle like the laughter of a capricious god, and Elena's grip on his sleeve began to weaken. The grip on Marcus's sleeve loosened, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, he felt himself suspended between two impossible realities. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in evidence-based medicine, peer-reviewed studies, and the immutable laws of biology, screamed that this was madness brought on by exhaustion and trauma. But Elena's pulse beneath his fingertips was fading, and Adrian's words echoed with a truth that bypassed logic entirely. "Dr. Thorne?" Patricia's voice cut through his paralysis. "We're losing her." The familiar weight of responsibility crashed back down on him, muscle memory taking over. "Get me 2 units of O-negative stat. I don't care if it's not a perfect match. We'll deal with the reaction if she survives long enough to have one. Already tried." The blood bank's backup refrigeration failed 20 minutes ago. Everything we had left spoiled. Marcus's hands moved automatically, checking pupils, assessing respiration, but his mind was fracturing. This was Seattle General Hospital, where he'd worked the night shift for 3 years, 3 months, and 16 days, where he knew every nurse's coffee order and could navigate the supply closets in complete darkness, where he'd built a carefully constructed life designed around one simple principle: save everyone he could, because he couldn't save the one who mattered most. His apartment was 12 minutes away by car, a sparse one-bedroom that Patricia had once described as aggressively beige. No photos on the walls except for one small frame he kept face down on the nightstand. His routine was sacred in its simplicity. Arrive at 11 p.m., work until 7 a.m., stop at the same diner for black coffee and wheat toast, sleep until 6 p.m., repeat. He'd convinced himself it was enough, that the steady parade of lives saved could somehow balance the cosmic ledger. "Doctor," Adrian's voice was impossibly calm, "you're running out of time." Elena's eyes found Marcus's again, and he saw himself reflected in their dimming light. A man who'd traded his faith in miracles for the cold comfort of statistics. After Sophie's death, he'd left pediatric oncology, unable to face another parent's desperate hope. He'd chosen emergency medicine because it was supposed to be different. Quick decisions, clear outcomes, strangers whose stories he'd never have to carry home. But Elena wasn't staying a stranger. Something about her reminded him not just of Sophie, but of the man he'd been before. The doctor who'd believed medicine was about more than merely postponing death. The father who'd read bedtime stories about brave princesses and promised his daughter that love could conquer anything. "I have work to finish," Elena whispered again, her voice barely audible over the storm. "A restoration. Caravaggio's The Taking of Christ. It's been waiting in my studio since the accident. Since Michael—" Her words dissolved into labored breathing, but Marcus caught something in her expression that he recognized. The same look Sophie had worn when she'd asked him to finish reading The Secret Garden after she was gone, because Mary Lennox deserved to see the flowers bloom. Adrian stepped closer, and Marcus caught that strange scent again, ancient parchment and midnight rain. "You've been punishing yourself for 3 years, working these night shifts like a monk's penance. But penance without hope is just suffering, Dr. Thorne, and suffering serves no one." The words hit deeper than they should have. Marcus thought of his empty apartment, his estranged ex-wife Sarah who'd moved to Portland and stopped returning his calls, the colleagues who'd learned not to invite him for drinks after his shifts. He'd structured his entire existence around not feeling too much, not risking too much, not failing again. But looking at Elena now, watching the light fade from eyes that held the same stubborn spark Sophie's had, He felt something crack inside his chest. The careful walls he'd built, around his heart, around his hope, around the dangerous possibility that some lives might be worth any price, began to crumble. The transformation, Marcus heard himself say, his voice hoarse. What exactly would it require? Patricia shot him a sharp look, probably assuming he was asking about some experimental procedure she hadn't heard of. But Adrian's smile was answer enough, ancient, sad, and tinged with something that might have been relief. An exchange, Adrian said simply. My blood for hers, my curse shared. And your consent, as her physician and the one who chooses to save her, to bear the weight of that decision. Thunder crashed overhead, and the lights flickered again. In that moment of strobing darkness, Marcus saw his life laid out in stark clarity, an endless succession of quiet nights, small victories, and the persistent ache of wondering what if. He thought of the engagement ring he'd never returned to the jeweler, hidden in his sock drawer next to the hospital ID badge that still bore his old title, Dr. Marcus Thorne, Pediatric Oncology. Elena's pulse stuttered under his fingertips, and time condensed to this single heartbeat, this one impossible choice that would either damn them both or offer something he'd stopped believing in 3 years ago. The possibility of redemption. The monitors flatlined. The sound cut through the emergency room like a scream, that terrible monotone wail that had haunted Marcus's dreams for 3 years. Elena's hand went limp against his sleeve, her fingers uncurling like flower petals releasing their hold on life. In the stuttering red glow of the emergency lighting, her face took on the waxy pallor Marcus had seen too many times before. She's coding, Patricia called out, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. The crash cart's wheels squealed against the linoleum as she maneuvered it into position, muscle memory overriding the futility they all recognized. Marcus's hands moved without conscious thought, positioning themselves over Elena's chest for compressions. But Adrian's pale fingers closed around his wrist with surprising strength, stopping him mid-motion. No, Adrian said quietly. Not this time. The emergency room around them seemed to hold its breath. Even the storm outside appeared to pause, as if the entire world was waiting for Marcus's decision. In the sudden quiet, he could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, drowning out everything except the impossible choice that Adrian had laid before him. Dr. Thorne? Patricia's voice was sharp with confusion. What are you doing? We need to... Clear the room. The words came from Marcus's mouth, but he barely recognized his own voice. It sounded like someone else speaking. Someone braver, or perhaps more desperate than the careful man he'd become. What? I said clear the room. Now. Marcus looked up at Patricia, seeing his own reflection in her wide eyes. 23 years of nursing experience, and she'd never heard him give an order like this. Tell them there was a gas leak. Electrical hazard. I don't care what you say. Just get everyone out of this section. Patricia stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus saw the exact second she made her own impossible choice, to trust him, even when everything about this situation violated every protocol they'd sworn to uphold. She nodded once, sharply, and began herding the other staff away from Elena's bed. You're sure about this? Adrian's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of centuries. Once this begins, there's no undoing it. She'll wake up tomorrow night different than she was tonight, and you'll have to live with being the one who chose that for her. Marcus looked down at Elena's still face, and for a moment he saw Sophie instead, his little girl with her dark hair spread across the hospital pillow, asking him why the medicine wasn't working anymore. He'd promised her that everything would be okay, right up until the moment her heart stopped beating. The lie had tasted like ashes in his mouth then, just as it would now if he walked away. But this time, impossibly, there was another option. She said she had work to finish, Marcus said, his fingers finding Elena's cooling wrist. No pulse, no flutter of life beneath the skin. A painting that's been waiting for 3 years. The same amount of time I've been... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. The same amount of time you've been waiting to forgive yourself, Adrian completed softly. The last of the medical staff disappeared around the corner, their voices fading into the general chaos of the hospital. Marcus and Adrian stood alone in the crimson-lit bay with Elena's body, the monitors still wailing their electronic dirge. Outside, the storm seemed to intensify, rain lashing against the windows with renewed fury. "If I do this," Marcus said, "if I say yes, what does that make me?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his ancient eyes reflecting the emergency lights. "The same thing it made me, 500 years ago when I watched my sister die of plague, a man who discovered that some prices are worth paying and some sins are worth carrying." He paused, studying Marcus's face. "The question isn't what it makes you. The question is whether you can live with letting her go when you had the power to save her." Marcus closed his eyes and felt the weight of every choice that had led him to this moment. The decision to specialize in pediatric oncology because he'd believed in miracles. The choice to pursue experimental treatments for Sophie, buying her 3 extra months that might have been filled with pain instead of peace. The move to emergency medicine, to night shifts, to a life carefully constructed around not caring too much. All of it had led here, to this stranger who reminded him of his daughter, and this impossible offer that challenged everything he thought he knew about life and death, and the space between them. When he opened his eyes, Elena's face was peaceful in the red light, but he could see the faint smile lines around her eyes, the calluses on her fingers that spoke of hours spent with brushes and canvas. A life interrupted, like Sophie's had been, like his own had been, 3 years ago in a different hospital room. "Do it," Marcus whispered, and felt his carefully ordered world shatter completely. Adrian moved with impossible grace, his pale hands hovering over Elena's still form. But then he stopped. His ancient eyes found Marcus's in the flickering emergency light, and for the first time since this nightmare began, uncertainty flickered across his ageless features. "You said the words," Adrian said quietly, "but your heart hasn't followed." "I can hear it, Doctor. The doubt eating at you like acid. The fear." Marcus's hands trembled as he maintained his position beside the gurney. The monitors continued their mechanical death song, each electronic wail driving home the finality of what lay before them. "I said do it. I meant it." "Did you?" Adrian's voice carried the weight of centuries spent reading human souls. "Or are you simply running from another failure? There's a difference between choosing salvation and choosing escape from guilt." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His carefully constructed resolve wavered, and suddenly he was drowning in the implications of what he'd just agreed to. Elena would wake up tomorrow night as something inhuman, bound to darkness and blood, watching everyone she'd ever loved age and die, while she remained frozen in this moment of death and resurrection. What gave him the right to make that choice for her? "She's already gone," Marcus said, but his voice cracked on the words. "Clinical death occurred 4 minutes ago. Brain death will follow in." "Up!" Adrian's command was sharp enough to cut through Marcus's spiraling rationalization. "Don't hide behind medical terminology. This isn't about clinical protocols. This is about a woman who trusted you to save her life, and you're about to bind her to an existence she never asked for." Marcus staggered backward from the gurney, the full weight of what he'd been about to do crashing down on him. In his desperation to avoid another failure, another Sophie, he'd been willing to condemn a stranger to immortal darkness. The careful walls he'd built around his conscience crumbled, leaving him exposed to the terrible truth of his own selfishness. "God," he whispered, running shaking hands through his hair. "What was I thinking? I can't. I don't have the right to make this decision for her. She didn't consent to this. She doesn't even know what you're offering." "You begin to understand the true weight of this choice," Adrian said, his voice gentling slightly. "I've watched you for months, Dr. Thorne. I've seen you throw yourself into these night shifts like a man seeking absolution. But absolution cannot be bought with someone else's damnation." The storm outside seemed to echo Marcus's inner turmoil, thunder rolling across the Seattle skyline in waves that made the hospital windows shudder. In the distance he could hear Patricia's voice directing the evacuation of the emergency bay, buying them precious time that now felt like a curse rather than a blessing. "She's an artist," Marcus said, his eyes fixed on Elena's peaceful face. "She restores paintings, brings back beauty that time has tried to destroy. She has calluses on her fingers from holding brushes, laugh lines around her eyes. She probably has family, friends, dreams that don't involve living forever in the shadows." "Yes," Adrian agreed simply. "And in approximately 6 minutes, all of that will be gone. Her art will remain unfinished. Her laughter will be silenced. The light in those eyes will fade forever." Marcus felt himself being pulled apart by competing truths. The rational part of his mind recoiled from what Adrian offered. It was violation of the highest order, condemning someone to an existence they'd never chosen. But the part of him that had held Sophie's hand as she died screamed that any existence was better than none at all. "How do you live with it?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Carrying the weight of that choice for someone else?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice held the accumulated pain of 5 centuries. "Some nights I'm not certain that I do, but then I remember my sister's face when the plague took her, the fear in her eyes, the desperate way she clung to life, even as it slipped away. And I know that if she had been given the choice, truly given the choice, she would have taken the darkness over the void. But Elena can't choose," Marcus said. "She's already gone." "Is she?" Adrian moved closer to the gurney, his pale hand hovering over Elena's forehead. "Her body has failed, yes, but consciousness, that's a more complex thing than your medical textbooks suggest. She may still be there, in that space between heartbeats, waiting for someone brave enough to call her back." Marcus stared at Elena's still form, torn between hope and horror. Everything he'd been trained to believe told him this was madness. Death was death, and there was no negotiating with that fundamental truth. But looking at her peaceful face, he found himself desperate to believe that Adrian might be right, that somewhere in that failing body, Elena Vasquez was still fighting to return to her unfinished painting and her interrupted life. The question was whether he had the courage, or the cruelty, to help her find her way back. Marcus knelt beside the gurney, his face inches from Elena's still features. The emergency room's red lighting cast everything in the color of blood, but he forced himself to ignore the symbolism. If Adrian was right, if some fragment of consciousness still lingered in that space between life and death, then perhaps this wasn't a choice he'd be making for her after all. "Elena," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm's fury. "I know you can't respond, but if you're still there, if you can hear me somehow—" He paused, feeling foolish yet desperate. "Blink, move your fingers. Give me some sign that you want to fight." Nothing. Her face remained peaceful, unmarked by the violence that had brought her here. But as Marcus watched, studying her features with the intensity he'd once reserved for reading Sophie's fever charts, he noticed something that made his breath catch. A single tear, barely visible in the crimson light, tracking slowly down her left temple. "Did you see that?" Marcus's voice cracked with sudden hope. Adrian leaned forward, his ancient eyes studying Elena's face with supernatural focus. "Tears can be involuntary. Cellular response to—" "No." Marcus's conviction surprised them both. "I've seen enough death to know the difference. That wasn't cellular response. She's still in there." The monitors continued their monotone wail, declaring what medical science understood about death, but Marcus found himself remembering something Elena had said before she lost consciousness, not just about her unfinished painting, but about Michael. Someone she'd lost in the accident, perhaps. Someone whose memory she wasn't ready to abandon by following him into whatever came after. "Tell me exactly what happens," Marcus said, his hand finding Elena's cooling fingers. "Every detail. What she'll wake up to, what she'll lose, what she'll gain. If I'm going to help make this choice, I need to understand what we're offering her." Adrian's expression grew somber. "She'll wake tomorrow night with supernatural strength, enhanced senses, and an eternal existence tied to darkness. She'll need to feed on blood to survive, not necessarily human blood, but blood nonetheless. She'll watch everyone she loves age and die while she remains frozen at 28. He paused. But she'll also have time, centuries to complete not just one painting but thousands, to master arts that haven't been invented yet, to see the world transform in ways no mortal ever could. And the cost? Sunlight becomes her enemy. She'll lose the simple pleasure of a warm day, the ability to have children, the comfort of aging alongside those she loves. She'll carry the weight of immortality, all its wonders and all its isolation. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the terrible responsibility of what he was contemplating settle around his shoulders like a lead blanket. In pediatric oncology, he'd learned to present treatment options to families facing impossible choices, the language of hope balanced against harsh realities, percentages that could never capture the full weight of a human life. But this was different. This was offering Elena an existence so far removed from human experience that he could barely comprehend its implications. "In your 5 centuries," Marcus said slowly, "have you ever regretted it? The choice your maker made for you?" Adrian's silence stretched long enough that Marcus wondered if he would answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of accumulated lifetimes. "I have regretted many things, Dr. Thorne, but I have never regretted the opportunity to love again, to create again, to find meaning in an existence I initially saw as cursed." Thunder crashed overhead, and the lights flickered ominously. Somewhere in the distance, Marcus could hear the hospital's backup generators struggling against the storm's fury. Time was running out in more ways than one. "If we do this," Marcus said, his decision crystallizing with each word, "I need your word that you'll help her adjust, that you won't abandon her to figure out immortality alone. You have it." Marcus looked down at Elena one more time, seeing not just her peaceful face but imagining the paintings yet to come. Centuries of art flowing from hands that should have stilled tonight. Beauty that would never exist if he let fear make this choice for them all. He thought of Sophie, of the stories he'd promised to finish reading to her after she was gone, of Sarah, who'd accused him of playing God with experimental treatments that only prolonged their daughter's suffering, of every night shift he'd worked since, trying to balance the cosmic ledger with strangers' lives because he couldn't save the one that mattered most. Some prices were worth paying. Some sins were worth carrying. "Do it," Marcus said, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice. "Bring her back." As Adrian positioned his pale wrist over Elena's lips, Marcus felt himself cross a threshold from which there would be no return. He was no longer the careful doctor who hid behind statistics and protocols. He was something far more dangerous, a man who still believed in miracles, even when they came dressed as damnation. The transformation began. The first sign that something had gone wrong came not from Elena, but from the hospital itself. As Adrian's blood touched Elena's lips, the backup generators groaned and died, plunging the emergency bay into complete darkness. The monitors fell silent mid-wail, their electronic protests cut short by the sudden power failure. Even the storm seemed to pause, as if the entire world was holding its breath. "That shouldn't have happened," Marcus whispered, but his voice was swallowed by shadows so complete he couldn't see his own hands. Then came the screaming. It started in the main corridor, high, terrified shrieks that cut through the darkness like broken glass. Multiple voices, rising and falling in waves of panic that had nothing to do with a simple power outage. Marcus had heard enough trauma to recognize true terror when it echoed off hospital walls. "Adrian?" Marcus reached out blindly, his fingers finding empty air where the vampire had stood moments before. "What's happening? Something that should not be possible." Adrian's voice came from somewhere near the windows, tight with an emotion Marcus had never heard from him before. Fear. "My kind do not travel alone through storms like this unless they are hunting." A new sound joined the cacophony, the sharp crack of breaking glass, followed by inhuman snarls that raised every primitive alarm Marcus possessed. Whatever had arrived at Seattle General wasn't interested in medical emergencies. Emergency lighting flickered back to life, casting the bay in hellish red once again. Elena lay motionless on the gurney, Adrian's blood still glistening on her lips, but her transformation had been interrupted. Her skin remained deathly pale, her chest still. "Is she?" Marcus began. "Suspended," Adrian said curtly, moving to the bay's entrance with predatory grace. "Between life and death, between human and vampire. If we don't complete the ritual soon, she'll be lost to both." The screaming grew closer. Through the red-tinted darkness, Marcus saw shapes moving in the main corridor. Too fast to be human, too purposeful to be random violence. One shadow detached itself from the others, gliding toward their bay with deliberate intent. Dr. Marcus Thorne. The voice that emerged from the darkness was cultured, amused, and absolutely terrifying. How fascinating to find Seattle's most guilt-ridden physician consorting with my old student. A figure stepped into the emergency lighting, tall, pale, and wearing an expensive suit that looked like it had walked out of another century. His eyes fixed on Marcus with predatory interest before shifting to Adrian. "Lucian." Adrian's voice held 5 centuries of complicated history. "This is not your territory. Territory is such a limiting concept, don't you think?" Lucian's gaze fell on Elena's suspended form, and his smile revealed fangs that gleamed like porcelain. "Besides, when one of my children begins making new vampires without permission, it becomes my concern regardless of geography." Marcus felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "Permission? Oh, did Adrian not explain the rules to you, Doctor?" Lucian moved closer to Elena's gurney with fluid grace. "Vampires are not created casually. Each new immortal requires approval from the regional authority, in this case, myself. The penalty for unauthorized turning is quite severe." "She's dying," Marcus said, stepping protectively closer to Elena, despite every instinct screaming at him to run. "We couldn't wait for bureaucracy." Lucian laughed, a sound like crystal breaking. "Bureaucracy? Dear Doctor, you misunderstand entirely. This isn't about paperwork. This is about power, control, and the very careful balance we maintain between our world and yours." Another crash echoed from the corridor, followed by Patricia's voice shouting orders to evacuate the building. Marcus realized with growing horror that the entire hospital was under siege, and Elena, suspended between life and death, was at the center of it. "Complete the transformation," Marcus said urgently to Adrian. "Whatever this is about, we can sort it out after she's alive." "I'm afraid that's no longer an option," Lucian said smoothly. He gestured, and 2 more figures emerged from the shadows, vampires who moved with the same predatory grace, but whose eyes held none of Lucian's urbane amusement. "Elena Vasquez has been claimed by higher authority." "Claimed?" Adrian's voice turned dangerous. "Did you think her accident was random, old friend? Elena isn't just any artist. She's the last descendant of the Vasquez line. Her family has been useful to our kind for generations. Her blood carries certain properties that make it exceptionally valuable." Marcus felt sick understanding wash over him. "You caused the accident. You've been planning this." "Planning is such a crude word. Let's say I've been orchestrating optimal outcomes." Lucian's smile widened. "Elena was always meant to join our ranks, but under my guidance, not Adrian's misguided mercy." The monitors around Elena's bed suddenly sparked back to life, but instead of flat lines, they showed impossible readings. Heartbeat flickering between 0 and 200, brain activity spiking in patterns that defied medical explanation. Elena's eyes snapped open, glowing with an inner light that belonged to neither life nor death. The real test was just beginning. Elena's luminescent gaze swept the emergency bay, taking in the crimson lighting, the shadowy figures and the palpable tension crackling between Adrian and Lucian. When her eyes found Marcus, he saw something that chilled him more than her supernatural transformation, complete awareness. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that made the remaining monitors flicker. "What have you done to me?" Before Marcus could answer, Lucian stepped forward with predatory elegance. "Welcome to consciousness, Miss Vasquez. I am Lucian Ashworth, and I've been waiting to meet you for quite some time." Elena sat up on the gurney with fluid grace that belonged to neither the living nor the dead. Her artist's hands, those same hands Marcus had noticed bore calluses from years of careful restoration work, now moved with supernatural precision as she examined her transformed fingers. "I remember dying," she said, her glowing eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "Internal bleeding. You couldn't stop it." I felt myself slipping away. Her expression hardened, and then I felt something else, something foreign entering my body without my permission. Marcus stepped forward, his guilt a physical weight in his chest. "Elena, you have to understand." "Do I?" She swung her legs off the gurney, standing with impossible steadiness for someone who had been clinically dead minutes ago. "Because I'm feeling remarkably clear-headed for someone who supposedly couldn't consent to whatever this is." Adrian moved protectively between Elena and Lucian's vampires, but his attention remained fixed on her with growing concern. The transformation shouldn't have left her with such immediate awareness. Something is different about her awakening. "Of course something is different," Lucian said with satisfaction. "The Vasquez bloodline carries genetic markers that have been carefully cultivated over 6 generations. Elena isn't just any new vampire, she's the culmination of a very specific breeding program." "Breeding program?" Elena's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that made Marcus's skin crawl. "You're talking about my family. My grandmother, my mother, both of whom served our community beautifully before their natural deaths." Lucian continued smoothly. "Your grandmother's paintings hang in several of our sanctuaries. Your mother's sculptures grace the gardens of our European estates. Art created by humans who understood their purpose in our world." Marcus watched Elena process this revelation, seeing her artist's mind working through the implications with terrifying speed. The woman who had spoken so lovingly of her unfinished painting now stood transformed, learning that her entire family legacy had been manipulated by creatures she'd never known existed. "You killed Michael," Elena said suddenly, the pieces clicking together. "The accident wasn't random. You murdered my brother to get to me." "Regrettable but necessary," Lucian replied without a trace of remorse. "He was protective of you in ways that would have complicated the transition. Better to remove that obstacle cleanly." The monitors around them began sparking more violently as Elena's emotions spiked. Marcus realized with growing alarm that her transformation had left her with abilities that were already beyond normal vampiric limits. The very air in the room seemed to vibrate with her rage. "Dr. Thorne," Elena said, turning her luminous gaze back to him, "you made a choice about my life without asking me. But more than that, you made a choice that delivered me directly into the hands of my family's killers." Marcus felt the full weight of his catastrophic mistake settling around him like a shroud. In his desperation to avoid another failure, another Sophie, he had rescued Elena from death only to deliver her into something far worse. The careful moral calculations that had led him to accept Adrian's offer crumbled in the face of this larger horror. "I didn't know," he whispered, but the excuse sounded hollow even to himself. "I thought I was saving you." "Were you?" Elena's enhanced senses picked up something the others had missed. The sound of more vehicles arriving outside, engines too quiet to be human emergency responders. "Or were you saving yourself? Trying to fix your guilt over your daughter by playing God with a stranger's life?" The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow because it carried the ring of terrible truth. In his memories of those desperate moments, how much of his choice had really been about Elena's welfare, and how much had been about his own need to prove he could still save someone. "The philosophical discussions can wait," Lucian interrupted, gesturing toward the windows where more shadows moved with inhuman purpose. "My associates have secured the building. Elena will come with us now to begin her proper education in what she has become." "No." Elena's response was quiet but carried such authority that even Lucian's vampires stepped back involuntarily. "I will not be collected like property, not by you, and not by anyone else." Adrian looked between Elena and the exit, calculating odds that seemed to grow worse by the moment. Elena, you're powerful, but you're also newly turned. Lucian has resources you can't imagine. Then we'll have to be creative, Elena said, her artist's mind already working through possibilities that made Marcus both hopeful and terrified. After all, I've spent years restoring things that everyone else thought were permanently destroyed. As if summoned by her words, the storm outside intensified, and Marcus realized they were about to discover exactly what kind of vampire Elena Vasquez had become. The first test of Elena's newfound power came not through intention, but through pure, instinctive rage. As Lucian's vampires moved to flank her, Elena's luminous eyes blazed brighter, and every piece of electronic equipment in the emergency bay exploded simultaneously. Not sparking or flickering, exploding. Monitors burst in showers of glass and sparks, the defibrillators' capacitors discharged with sounds like gunshots, and the overhead lights shattered, raining fragments onto the linoleum floor. The emergency bay plunged into absolute darkness, but Marcus could still see Elena clearly. Her transformed form seemed to generate its own pale radiance that outlined her silhouette against the chaos. Fascinating, Lucian's voice carried through the darkness, unperturbed by the destruction. Even more developed than we anticipated. Elena, my dear, you've just demonstrated why your bloodline is so valuable to us. And you've just demonstrated why I'll never willingly serve you, Elena replied. Marcus heard the sound of movement, too fast and too fluid to follow in the darkness, followed by a heavy impact against the far wall. When the emergency lighting flickered back on, one of Lucian's vampires was embedded in the concrete, his expensive suit torn and his predatory composure replaced by shocked confusion. Elena stood where he had been, her hospital gown somehow pristine despite the violence. Impossible, Adrian breathed. No newly turned vampire should have that kind of strength. Even with enhanced bloodlines, the power takes decades to develop. Marcus realized with growing terror that his choice to save Elena had unleashed something none of them, not even Lucian, had fully anticipated. The guilt over Sophie, the desperate need to prove he could still save someone, had led him to create a supernatural force that was already beyond anyone's control. Dr. Thorne, Elena said, her glowing eyes finding his in the crimson emergency lighting, I need to know something, and I need you to answer honestly. The embedded vampire was pulling himself from the wall with inhuman resilience, but Elena's attention remained focused entirely on Marcus. Around them, Lucian and Adrian watched with the careful stillness of predators reassessing a suddenly dangerous situation. In that moment, when you accepted his offer, Elena continued, her voice carrying supernatural authority that made it impossible to look away, when you chose to transform me without consent, what were you thinking about? My welfare, or your daughter's death? The question hit Marcus like a scalpel finding exactly the right nerve. He opened his mouth to give her the comfortable lie, the professional explanation about doing everything possible to save a patient. But Elena's enhanced senses read his body language, his micro-expressions, his heartbeat with supernatural precision. Both, he whispered, the truth torn from him against his will. I saw Sophie dying again. I felt that same helplessness, that same failure. And I couldn't let it happen again, even if it meant damning you to something I didn't understand. Elena nodded slowly, and Marcus realized she had needed that honesty to make her next choice. Then you need to understand something, Doctor. Your guilt about your daughter's death doesn't give you the right to make life-altering decisions for strangers. Your need to feel useful doesn't justify playing with other people's souls. Elena, Adrian interrupted urgently, we can discuss medical ethics later. Right now we need to— No, Elena said, turning her luminous gaze on the vampire who had orchestrated her transformation. Right now, I need everyone in this room to understand exactly what they've created. She gestured, and Marcus felt the temperature drop so rapidly that his breath became visible. The remaining functional equipment began crackling with electrical discharge that followed no known laws of physics. Most unsettling of all, The shadows themselves seemed to bend toward Elena, as if responding to some fundamental force she was unconsciously wielding. "I spent my entire adult life restoring damaged art," Elena continued, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Marcus's bones. "I learned to see beauty in broken things, to find the original intention beneath centuries of corruption and neglect." Her smile revealed fangs that gleamed like polished silver. "I also learned to identify when something was damaged beyond repair and needed to be completely deconstructed before it could be made whole again." Lucien's urbane composure finally cracked. "Elena, you're speaking of things you don't understand. The vampire community has structures, hierarchies, laws that have maintained order for millennia. Structures built on breeding programs and murder," Elena replied. "Hierarchies that treat human families like livestock, laws that permit the slaughter of innocents like my brother." The electrical discharge around her intensified. "Those structures sound thoroughly corrupted to me." Marcus realized with crystalline clarity that his desperate attempt to save one life had set in motion events that would challenge the fundamental order of the supernatural world. Elena wasn't just a new vampire. She was a force of change that threatened everyone's carefully maintained power. The ordeal wasn't just beginning for Elena. It was beginning for them all. The moment Elena finished speaking, the world around them began to collapse. It started with a sound Marcus had never heard before, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to emanate from the building's very foundations. The walls of Seattle General Hospital groaned like a living thing in pain, and hairline cracks appeared in the concrete, spreading outward from Elena's position with geometric precision. "She's destabilizing the structure," Adrian said, his centuries of composure finally cracking. "Elena, you have to control this. Your emotions are manifesting physically." "My emotions?" Elena's laugh carried that same otherworldly resonance, and the cracks in the walls deepened. "My brother is dead. My family was manipulated for generations. I've been turned into a monster without consent. And you want me to control my emotions?" Lucien's remaining vampires pressed themselves against the far wall as chunks of ceiling began raining down around them. "This is what happens when transformations are performed without proper preparation," Lucien snarled at Adrian. "She has no idea how to channel her power." Marcus watched in horror as his attempt to save Elena's life destroyed everything around them. Through the emergency bay's windows, he could see other sections of the hospital buckling under forces that defied explanation. In the distance, ambulances were pulling away from the building, their patients being evacuated to other facilities. Patricia's voice echoed through the hospital's PA system, ordering a complete evacuation. "Elena, please." Marcus stepped toward her, his medical training screaming at him to somehow fix what he had broken. "People are going to be hurt. The patients upstairs are being evacuated because of choices you made," Elena replied, her glowing eyes fixed on him with terrible clarity. "Because you decided my death was less important than your guilt. Because you gambled with forces you didn't understand to salve your own conscience." Another section of ceiling collapsed, missing Marcus by inches. The sound of sirens wailed outside as emergency crews struggled to evacuate a building that was tearing itself apart from supernatural forces. "I was trying to save you," Marcus said desperately, dodging falling debris. "I couldn't let another person die when I had the power to prevent it. Did you have the power?" Elena's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Or did you just convince yourself you did because the alternative was admitting you're not God?" The words hit Marcus with more force than the collapsing building. Standing in the wreckage of his choice, watching a woman he'd condemned to immortality lose control of powers that threatened innocent lives, he finally saw the truth he'd been avoiding. His decision hadn't been about saving Elena at all. It had been about saving himself from feeling helpless again. "I killed you," he whispered, the realization crushing him. "I didn't save you. I killed the person you were and replaced her with this." Elena's expression shifted, some of the supernatural fury dimming in her luminous eyes. Finally, an honest answer. But her moment of clarity came too late. The damage was already spreading beyond the emergency bay, beyond the hospital itself. through the cracked windows, Marcus could see streetlights exploding in sequence, their glass showering the evacuation vehicles below. Car alarms wailed in electronic harmony as every piece of technology within a 2-block radius succumbed to Elena's uncontrolled power. "We have to get her away from populated areas," Adrian said urgently, "before this spreads to the entire city." "There is nowhere to take her," Lucian replied, his urbane mask finally dropping to reveal something ancient and terrified. "She's not channeling vampire abilities. She's rewriting the fundamental laws that govern our existence. This was never supposed to be possible." Marcus realized with crystalline horror that his desperate gamble had failed in ways he couldn't have imagined. He hadn't just damned Elena. He had unleashed something that threatened the careful balance between the supernatural and human worlds. The guilt that had driven him to accept Adrian's offer now paled beside the magnitude of destruction his choice had set in motion. "Elena," he said, his voice barely audible above the sounds of the building's death throes. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Tell me how to fix this." She looked at him with eyes that held centuries of knowledge, despite being transformed minutes ago, and Marcus saw something that terrified him more than her power or rage: disappointment. "Some things can't be fixed, Dr. Thorne," Elena said quietly. "Some things can only be endured." The floor beneath them gave way with a grinding roar, and Marcus fell through darkness, knowing that his attempt to cheat death had instead delivered everyone he tried to protect directly into its hands. The last thing he saw before the rubble claimed him was Elena's luminous form floating above the destruction, no longer bound by gravity or hope, while the city burned around her transformed power. His plan hadn't just failed. It had become the very catastrophe he'd tried to prevent.